Okay, welcome back. So, this is going to be part two of topic 8.4, where the Cold War was fought. So, as you remember, we are explaining not only how the Cold War was fought, but where it was fought. And so, we've already talked about the 40s and the 50s. In this video, we're going to specifically focus on the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. And at the very end, kind of, summarize what we've talked about. So the Cold War in the 60s, this is where we see some significant changes. So just to set the stage, when the calendar turns to 1960 in January, we have a very intense Cold War being fought. The United States is trying to contain communism. The Soviet Union is trying to spread communism. Both sides have a defensive military alliance system set up. Both sides are fighting across the globe, having seen conflict in China, having seen conflict in Korea and in the Middle East. And the threat of nuclear destruction is at its height because of the missile technology and the development of the hydrogen bomb. So the 60s is where we begin to see some changes. Now, as I said before, the brinksmanship created massive military stockpiles of weapons that could be delivered for both sides. And so both sides now have reached the stage of MAD. This is known as mutually assured destruction. Both sides have enough nuclear weapons to be able to end life as we know it. Now, let's stop right here. The Earth's not going to blow up into a bunch of asteroids. We don't have that many nuclear weapons. But what happens is there's so many nuclear warheads that could be delivered, and once they're launched, you really can't stop them, that it would have some catastrophic effects on the population immediately, but also within the next 3 to 5 weeks, a large number of people would die by radiation poisoning. So this MAD situation really gripped the world in the early 60s. So you see here that the leader of the United States, Kennedy, and the leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, both were wrestling, sitting on their hydrogen bombs. And what happens, it's going to be Cuba, which is going to kind of change what's going on. Cuba decides that they're going to go to the communist side. They're led by Fidel Castro. And what happens is Cuba, being 90 miles away from Miami, Florida, is very fearful of a United States invasion. So the Soviet Union, being a good ally, moves nuclear missiles to Cuba. This is what's known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. A United States spy plane flying over Cuba takes the picture that you see there. And you can see how those missiles are being prepared to be put in place and could be fired very quickly, hitting the United States, the southeastern United States, and causing nuclear destruction. As you can see by this map, everywhere that you would see within that red circle was in range of those missiles. So essentially, what happens is for 5 days, the United States and the Soviet Union basically have a stare down. And it's going to be the Soviet Union that backs off. They agree to remove the nuclear missiles and want to meet with the United States to begin to limit this threat of mutually assured destruction. Both sides begin to develop other means to respond to this. This is known as the flexible response. And one of the things that come from this are the special tactical units that the United States military has, such as Delta Force in the upper left, the Navy SEALs, Force Recon, things like that. So both sides now are specializing in these elite military units that can be sent without declaration of war to respond. This is going to give leaders options other than full nuclear weapons. So, this is a pretty significant change in Cold War tactics. During the 60s, the United States was embroiled in the Vietnam conflict. Brief background is Vietnam was a French colony, and their leader, Ho Chi Minh, who would be their nationalist leader, helped the United States in World War II. Now, at the end of the war, Ho Chi Minh proclaimed Vietnam independent. But due to the threat of France falling to communism, the United States decided that France should keep Vietnam as a colony. Throughout the 50s, the Vietnamese, who had now turned to communism, fought the French, and in 1957 had won their independence from the French. But in the peace treaty, what happens is this. Instead of creating a unified Vietnam, what happens is they create a communist North Vietnam and a capitalist South Vietnam. And it's here that we see this proxy war start. Vietnam really drags on throughout the 60s, causing a great deal of protest. And in the 70s, we're going to see another change in the Cold War. We see the emergence of what is known as détente, the easing of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. Leaders met, writing not only the SALT I and the SALT II treaties to limit the amount of nuclear weapons, but also to agree to peacefully coexist. This was done to prevent the war and the bloodshed that had gone on. Now, during the 70s, we do see communist revolts in sub-Saharan Africa. And right at the very end of the 70s, the Soviet Union decides to invade Afghanistan. So, during the 60s, we see the change in the development of the flexible response and moving away from nuclear weapons. And in the 70s, we do begin to see a détente, a peaceful coexistence. But we also see the continuation of proxy wars, this time in Africa and in Asia. This leads us to the 80s. In the 80s, the Cold War is going to heat up again. And this was done by President Ronald Reagan, who called the Soviet Union the evil empire, who called for the Soviets to end communism and to bring freedom in there. Now, during the 80s, late 70s, 80s, we see more communist conflict, proxy wars in Central America. We see Guatemala, El Salvador, Panama, Nicaragua, Honduras. Cuba remains, but also Haiti begins to flirt with it. Now, the Soviet Union, behind the scenes, had been going through some pretty significant problems. They had a food shortage. They had a shortage of consumer goods. Factories had shut down, and overall life was not good. And the people were beginning to grumble. So Mikhail Gorbachev begins to make some changes. The first change is called perestroika. This is the policy that Gorbachev pursued to restructure the economy, to include certain capitalist elements, but keeping communism in place, in an attempt to make it more efficient and to end the shortages. He also created what's called glasnost, the policy that stressed openness, ending the censorship in the authoritarian government. So obviously you know what's going to happen next. But if you haven't figured it out, this is the beginning of the end of the Cold War because it's the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. But let's kind of review what we talked about in these two videos. We wanted to explain how and where the Cold War was fought around the world. So in the 40s, the main location was in Europe. And what you see is the post-war world decisions where one side allowed the self-determination and these nations became democratic and capitalist, where the other side in Eastern Europe spread communism. This created the Iron Curtain, the dividing fortified border between Eastern and Western Europe. The United States is seeking to contain communism to where it is, but the Soviet Union continues to try to spread it. So the United States creates NATO, the first defensive military organization. In the 50s, the height of the Cold War becomes global. You have China, you have Korea, and you have the Middle East being helped through the doctrines, the Eisenhower and the Truman doctrines. Those are just two plans to provide financial and military aid for anybody who's fighting communism. We also see Sputnik leading to this arms race, eventually leading to brinksmanship. During the 60s, the Cold War begins to change, spreading to other places such as Cuba and Vietnam. And whereas the decade started with MAD, mutually assured destruction, because of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the closeness that we came to nuclear war, the flexible response was developed, moving away from nuclear development. During the 70s, we see Cold War proxy wars in Africa and Asia, most importantly Angola and Afghanistan. But we also see a further change. Détente and the SALT treaties begin to kind of reach a peaceful coexistence. But with the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, and when I'm talking about that's in the 70s, that's Christmas Day 1979, the Cold War becomes hot again. In the 80s, the Cold War is fought mostly in Latin America, but also a little bit in other areas. Reagan begins to put the pressure on the Soviet Union, calling them out and developing new weapon systems called the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, lasers that can shoot down nuclear missiles. And the Soviet Union, being faced with economic problems, begins to reform through glasnost and perestroika.